Let's talk Greenland. As we speak right now here in Washington, D.C., the Danish Foreign Minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, and his Greenlandic counterpart are meeting with Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance at the White House to discuss the issue of Greenland and whether the United States should possess Greenland as part of for its national security. Greenland sits at the intersection of multiple strategic challenges facing the United States and its allies. The island's geographic position, bridging North America and Europe, makes it critical for transatlantic security, early warning systems, and freedom of navigation in increasingly contested Arctic waters. At the same time, Greenland's vast natural resources, including rare earth minerals, are essential to modern-day defense systems, have attracted attention from both allies and competitors around the world. The security environment is rapidly changing in the Arctic. Russia's war in Ukraine has also reverberated in the north, ending decades of Arctic exceptionalism and cooperative governance. Meanwhile, China has declared itself a near-Arctic state and seeks greater influence in the region through economic investments and scientific research. For Greenland, a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, these developments raise fundamental questions about sovereignty, security partnerships, and the island's future relationships with the United States, with Denmark, and NATO allies. Recent discussions about Greenland's strategic importance have brought renewed attention to the U.S. presence in Greenland, critical infrastructural vulnerabilities, and opportunities for deeper defense cooperation. So understanding Greenland's perspective, understanding the Arctic security environment has never been more important. And with me today, we have two just absolutely phenomenal guests to talk about this. We have Iris A. Ferguson, is a senior associate with the CSIS Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program, and is president and founder of IAF Strategies. She previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Arctic and Global Resilience from 2022 to January 2025. And Iris brings extensive experience in Arctic security policy and U.S. defense strategy in the High North. Also with us is Marisol Maddox. Marisol is a senior associate also with the CSIS Europe, Russia, Eurasia Program. She is also a senior Arctic fellow at the Arctic Institute. She's also senior Arctic fellow at the Institute of Arctic Studies in the Dickey Center at Dartmouth University. Her research considers the Arctic nexus of security, geopolitics, and environmental change, and she was formerly with the Wilson Center. I should also say I am Max Bergman. I am the director of the Europe, Russia, Eurasia Program. So let us dive right in. Iris, I want to start with you. You were at the Pentagon. You led the Pentagon's work and focus on the Arctic and Arctic security. Maybe you could give us sort of an overview of why is there this increased focus on the security of the Arctic? Is this totally new for the United States? Why are we now talking about the Arctic?
Yeah, thanks, Max. Yeah, it's an important question. It's kind of what's driving a lot of the headlines today. But this is not a new topic. I think the Arctic has long been strategically important for the United States. It's gotten increased attention because of some of the changes that are taking place in the region. You mentioned in your opening remarks, it's effectively a bridge between the Indo-Pacific, the United States, and Europe. It plays a really, really core function as a cornerstone for homeland defense for the United States. It's the closest avenue of attack for many of our adversaries who have advanced weaponry that could potentially hit us here in the homeland. So a lot of our homeland architecture is in the north in particular. And the competitors that we have are really recognizing the strategic importance and location. They're operating at pace. They have a strategy to develop the Arctic region in a way that they think suits their interests, and it's in the United States' interest to catch up and to define our own strategic interests meaningfully and protect them. But all of this, I think, is important to say that all of the changes, a lot of them are reflective of climate change and how climate change has impacted the region. when I was working in the Department of Defense, this was not an environmental slogan. It was a security condition. It is really critical for us to understand how the region is changing from an operational perspective, understand what we're able to do, how traffic patterns are changing, how our adversaries are acting. And to do so, you have to have environmental monitoring for that. As you mentioned, when I was serving in the Pentagon, the building recognized the strategic importance of the region and created the DASD ship that I had the honor of setting up and serving in. And one of the critical rationales for that DASD ship was, one, to create a strategy. We had a new Department of Defense strategy that came out in 2024, an updated one. And it also allowed for integration across really complicated department, and integration across the services, integration across the variety of combatant command teams that exist in the Arctic region, and also as a front door for our allies and partners to come when they wanted to talk about Arctic security.
And Marisol, maybe to turn it over to you to maybe talk a little bit more about the climate shifts that are occurring within the Arctic, and how that is kind of changing the Arctic, both environmentally, but also economically, commercially, and then potentially from the security standpoint as well.
Yeah, so we are now expecting to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels globally by 2030. This was further confirmed very recently by Copernicus. So in the Arctic, we've been seeing the warming occurring around 4 times faster than the global average. And this has had a tremendous impact, both acutely on a local level, but also increasingly we have a growing understanding of teleconnections. So being able to understand how changes that occur in the Arctic have far-reaching implications for other parts of the world. And that's a major driver of the interest of emerging powers like India, which is very concerned about how their monsoon precipitation is being impacted by global climate change. And I would actually say that there are acute direct impacts here with Greenland. First and foremost, the fact that the Greenland ice sheet contains 21 feet of global sea level rise locked up within it. At its highest point, it's over a mile high. And as the air temperatures are increasing and we're starting to get rain on the summit of Greenland, which had never happened in thousands of years, we're starting to see the Greenland ice sheet be impacted in pretty significant ways. And actually, by the DoD's own assessment, in 2023, there was a report to Congress that looked at the permafrost impacts to our Arctic installations. And the Pituffik Space Base in Greenland was assessed to have moderate to considerable exposure to those hazards. This is a place that's the home to really important ballistic missile early warning systems, the solid state phased array radar. We have, remote satellite tracking stations. We have aircraft hangar operations and airfields that are incredibly important because Pituffik is only accessible part of the year, like for a few months by sea. So mostly we need to rely upon these airfields and the aircraft hangars. And these are designated as priority facilities that are known to be impacted by the changing permafrost. And now we're really, because of kind of the politicization of climate, these are factors that are not being considered as significantly as they were before, which leads us to some potential blind spots here and things that our adversaries will be assessing that could create more risk for us.
Right. It seems like one of the great ironies of the focus on Greenland and the Arctic is largely because of climate change, because of how climate change is impacting that region, particularly when it comes to shipping. And yet that's also going to impact our presence there, but we're not, we've sort of, from a U.S. government perspective, are kind of closing our eyes to that aspect. Iris, I want to maybe turn back to you on the security standpoint. The president has talked a lot about how Greenland is really important to our security. Maybe we can drill down a bit on on the role Greenland plays in the early warning, how it's been used during the Cold War, or how we had our presence there during the Cold War, and what is the kind of threat and concern that we have, whether it's from Russia or China? What is the threat? Why are we nervous about Arctic security?
Yeah, thanks for that question. The Greenland, as I said before, it's long been considered strategic for decades. During the Cold War era, we had a lot of investment in and around Greenland. We had a variety of air bases, we had weather stations, we had naval ports. There's some really great maps that show the historical presence of the United States within Greenland. I also think it's really important to mention that the history of that presence isn't uncomplicated, Max. Some of the infrastructure that we developed within the island, we did so without asking, and it created a bit of a trust deficit that has, I think, continues to this day, quite frankly, about intentions of the United States. Following the end of the Cold War, we closed many of the bases that we thought were no longer necessary. It was actually really expensive to upkeep. It's very, as Marisol was saying, it's very hard to operate on the island. There's only a couple of months out of the year that you can even do construction should you want to do it. And certainly from a sea perspective, Pitifik, you can only access a couple of months out of the year. So we closed a lot of that infrastructure for cost saving measure, and because the threat had changed at the end of the Cold War, we were no longer using that base infrastructure to keep eyes on Russian bombers that we were worried about coming over the poles. Instead, we created the space architecture, this missile warning systems that are very exquisite. There's only a couple of them that we have in the world, and one of them is located in Pitifik. So that strategic location is still paramount to why we care about the region. But the other bases that we no longer needed, a lot of those we divested, and the Danish military, through their Joint Arctic Command, maintains control over a lot of the really important infrastructure that is still required for accessing the middle parts and the lower parts of the island from a security perspective. I also think it's important to mention that it's part of the geographically, it's a tricky space for the military in particular. It sits at a seam between NORTHCOM and EUCOM. Greenland is actually technically part of the North American continent from a geographic standpoint, and so you see the role that it can play in homeland defense, and the location of that radar is really very critical. You also saw NORTHCOM recently, several months ago, have Greenland be included in their area of operations as opposed to being part of Europe. I think that signals an increased emphasis on the role that Greenland plays for homeland defense in particular, and how NORTHCOM can think about the role that it can continue to play for homeland defense.
So maybe I could just follow up, Iris. Maybe you could. How has the administration approached the Arctic? I mean, when I read the national security strategy, I don't see really any mention of the Arctic. There's sort of been a deprioritization, it seems, at least from the national security strategy, of the threat posed by Russia. We have President Trump meeting with President Putin, trying to both negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine, but also negotiate sort of economic relationships. And it seems like we were very concerned about Greenland and Arctic security during the Cold War, when our major threat and adversary was the Soviet Union. How is the administration, sort of besides the president's rhetoric about Greenland, how has it approached the Arctic? What are you seeing from this administration's approach?
Yeah, I think you see a heavy emphasis on Arctic security, from a rhetoric perspective, coming at the highest levels. Obviously, you hear the president talking about Arctic security, you hear the vice president talking about Arctic security, you hear the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense talking about Arctic security. That signals a high level of interest in wanting to secure our U.S. interests. Where I think this is slightly diverges from previous administrations is, I think typically, traditionally, we've thought about the Arctic as a little bit being exceptional, as a theater of restraint, as a theater of stability. I do think the environment has changed rapidly, even in the last 4 or 5 years. And so we're seeing more of a policy of strength, of showing U.S. strength as a means of deterrence. I don't think that that's bad, actually. I think that that's an important signal to show that we can actually secure our own interests. But what we want to be focusing on is what our strengths are, and a huge amount of that strength is in our allies. I think our allies want to be a part of that strength because inherently they are. We're also seeing a heavy emphasis on building up the defense industrial base and on economic security. You've seen some pretty landmark money moving into icebreakers that has long been an issue that we've needed to invest in collectively. We've seen the continuation of Ice Pact, which was something that started under the Biden administration, which was a deal between Canada and Finland and the United States to try to co-develop icebreakers so that we could get them to market faster while we're slowly building up our own shipbuilding capacity. You see Golden Dome, which has implications for the Arctic. Should we be able to exercise that money and field it to enhance our missile defense? I think there's genuine interest in trying to secure the United States interests within the region from a monetary perspective and also from a statement perspective. I think we need to really be focusing on what those interests are, though, in reality, and a huge part of that is our allied capability and the trust that we have with our allies.
Okay, I want to turn to Marisol, but maybe we'll first go to a map because we have a map, and I think it's sometimes in talking about the Arctic, it's worth to sort of look at it from a map perspective, because oftentimes we look at it from sort of the classic map where Greenland is up top and it's very huge. But if you look at from the perspective of the North Pole, and Marisol, I want to bring you in to talk about how the Arctic is changing, but it's an incredibly big place, right? There's sort of very different parts of the Arctic. And if we look at it, right now there's an increase in Chinese shipping. Chinese presence in the Arctic is beginning, but that is largely going around the northern sea route, which is along the Russian coast, where ice is receding, I think, faster. When we talk about the threat posed by Russia, particularly from a nuclear perspective, the Russian Northern Fleet is here in the Kola Peninsula. Russian missiles would fly towards the United States that way. And that is why the early warning radar systems are very important here in Greenland. But when we talk about a Russian presence around Greenland or a Russian-Chinese presence, at least from my perspective, I don't think we're really seeing that. We're seeing that more in the Norwegian Sea, along the European Arctic, along Norway's coast. I'm curious how you see the kind of, Marisol, the changing of the of climate change is causing a lot of effects, but one of it is to potentially bring more Chinese vessels, make the Arctic more of a place for commercial shipping for China. If you can traverse the Arctic safely and securely, which is not always a given, it's significantly shorter than going around through the Suez Canal, especially to European ports in Rotterdam and other places in Northern Europe. So how do you see the kind of economic impacts of climate change? It seems to be leading to a much greater presence of China, of other actors in the region, and so maybe you could talk about how climate change is really impacting the economic story here.
Yeah, so climate change is making the region more accessible generally, right? So that the Arctic Ocean traditionally has been inaccessible because it's been frozen over, but the Arctic ice cap is thinning and shrinking, and we're expecting to see a seasonally navigable, so in the summer, navigable Arctic Ocean, over the top of the world, within, fewer years than makes me comfortable, I'll say. And so it's really, yes, there's interest in developing the maritime routes. Russia's interested in this in terms of the economic opportunities that it could gain from commercializing what it calls the Northern Sea Route. China's interested in the shorter route that you mentioned for shipping to Europe. It's also really becoming a place for great power projection. So we see, I think that if we saw, first I would kind of reel us back a little bit in terms of the shipping prospects, just to make it clear that that's a very complex issue and it's not quite as like rosy as it's often painted to be by Russia, who really wants to advance this idea that this is this new maritime route. We had over a dozen ships that got stuck in the Russian Arctic a few years ago because they thought it was going to be ice-free or much more navigable in October, and there was an early season freeze up, and it took months for Russia, even with all their icebreakers, they're busy, they have other things to do. They had very limited capacity to get them out and to be able to, rescue those crews. But we are seeing, especially after 2022 with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that Russia has become much more dependent upon China. We have seen really concessions psychologically from the Russians that I would not have expected to see so quickly. And I would namely say, point to this joint working group for development of the Northern Sea Route. The Arctic is the #1 region of strategic importance for Russia. And so to let China in on such a core interest is kind of interesting from an analytical standpoint. We also saw an agreement signed between the Russian Border Guard and the Chinese Coast Guard. So we are seeing an increase in cooperation and expansion of what China and Russia are cooperating on, and including more military presence, mostly off Alaska. And then just going back to kind of the power projection piece, this is where we're seeing that because there's so much attention now with media on what's happening up there. It's a great place for a country to really kind of project power. And we're seeing China really leading in that area with their investments into icebreakers, the presence that they've had up off the coast of Alaska when U.S. icebreakers have broken down and had to leave. These are things that the optics of it is something that's really played up a lot. China recently reached new depths going up to the North Pole with a submarine. And so they are trying to show that they're challenging U.S. undersea dominance here. So again, this is really just something where the cooperation is essential because this is a very large and complex region, and a lot of ways in which the U.S. seeks to secure its interests are really best pursued through an alliance structure.
Yeah, and maybe just to follow up, I mean, it seems that a lot of Chinese activity is not sort of by Greenland, it's by Alaska. It's going through the Bering Straits. And Iris, I mean, when you were looking at Chinese activity, I mean, were you concerned about Chinese presence around Greenland, or was it just in the Arctic in general, or is it in the Bering Straits close to Alaska? Is there a regional presence to how China is trying to, in the Arctic, about where China is going? Is Greenland the focal point of Chinese-Russian activities?
Yeah, well, when I was in the Pentagon, I think we were interested in where adversaries were operating globally. I think you're interested in where they're trying to gain strategic footholds globally to counter your own interests. And one of the places where we saw China becoming increasingly active was in the Arctic as a whole. They've they put out a white paper, I think it was 2018, that really laid out their strategy and vision for the region of wanting it to be kind of like a global commons, that they wanted to be able to have access and influence. They wanted to try to steer some of the governance mechanisms in their favor. They also created a concept called the Polar Silk Road, which they, I think, really tried to enact diplomatically and kind of going on a roadshow to various Arctic capitals to try to create economic development in Arctic states, to try to gain footholds in what we would call strategic locations, whether it be Norway or Finland, Sweden, Iceland. I think they pretty much knocked on the door of everyone. In Greenland in particular, they were very interested in gaining access to some mining rights and some of those old that old infrastructure I talked about that we originally created for the U.S. military, that's no longer something that we own. They were looking at investing in some of that. But I want to be really clear, Max, that I think that because of our outreach to our allies and partners, and because of our pushback, that we really quelled a lot of that investment, especially in the Nordic capitals in particular, to include Greenland. So a lot of I think, aspirations of China, I think they're still there. I think they just recognize that the political moment is not in their favor to actually access that from an investment perspective. Where we see them more military active is just as you say, it's much more on the Indo-Pacific side. Shockingly, that's where they're based. That's where a lot of their military capabilities reside. We do see an increasing level of activity from them on that side in the Arctic and in cooperation with Russia, which was not something that I think would have been predicted, several years ago. The level and depth of cooperation militarily, from naval exercises to aerial bombing campaigns together, to the level of economic dependence that exists between them in developing the Northern Sea Route. So that is a relationship that seems to be continuing at pace, and they continue to rely on one another for one another's benefit.
So I want to now sort of dive into the subject of Greenland, and specifically President Trump expressing his desires for the United States to possess Greenland, for Greenland to become a territory of the United States. And there's a number of reasons that I think have been laid out, and I sort of want to walk through them, and then also sort of talk about the internal politics within Greenland and within the Kingdom of Denmark. Maybe we'll start with the political situation inside of Greenland. There's been an independence movement. Greenland is a territory of the Kingdom of Denmark. They have elected representatives that both represent Greenland, but also sit in the Danish Parliament. They receive considerable funding and financing from the Danish government, particularly Danish healthcare. Denmark is responsible for the security of Greenland. Iris, or Marisol, maybe to you, is there a problem right now that you see in the current kind of political construct where Denmark possesses Greenland is a Danish territory and part of NATO? Is there a political concern that you have right now, or how do you assess the current state of the political environment of Greenland, Denmark, and the United States?
Yeah, so this has been a long process of Greenland seeking to become their own independent country. So, in 1979, they had the Home Rule Act. In 2009, it was the Self-Government Act. So all of these have kind of increased their ability to gain, more sovereignty, right? So they are a sovereign country. So the Kingdom of Denmark is made up of Denmark, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands, and it's the Commonwealth of 3 sovereign countries, but they're not fully independent yet, right? And so that's what Greenland is trying to do. The major stumbling block for them is really the economic independence piece. So they are still reliant upon this block grant of money that they get annually from Denmark every year. Their economy is largely made up of fisheries exports. And so they're working to diversify their economy and to diversify the partners that they are working with in terms of trade. And here I would actually point to the fact that China is an incredibly important trade partner for Greenland. And so one thing that the United States could do that the Greenlanders have expressed interest in is increase trade, right? And look at how do we reduce the barriers to trade and expand where we have this type of cooperation. But those conversations need to be predicated upon respect for self-determination for the Greenlanders, respect for sovereignty. And if you don't have that at the foundation, you can't have these other conversations. So, really I would go back to, so yes, the economic diversification piece. And then there has been a question about, how would the security element of Greenland advance? 2022's the full-scale invasion of Ukraine showed a lot of countries the limits of how much countries are able to have your back if you are not a member of NATO, right? So we had Finland and Sweden join the alliance. And we had Greenland then in 2023 actually added a representation to the Danish representation at NATO in Brussels. So they are now physically there, and they have demonstrated, and I mean, as recently as yesterday in remarks that, they see their future in NATO, right? And that is one of the concerns that the Trump administration has voiced, is that as Greenland is pursuing independence, we want to make sure that they are treaty bound and militarily aligned with us. And that is the course that we are currently on.
And maybe, Iris, we can turn to the security question, the security issue that the president has laid out as being a major concern. We sort of talked about it already. But during our current presence, we have, I think, roughly 150 troops. We have one base in Greenland. During the Cold War, we had roughly 6,000 forces based in Greenland. I think we had more than 15 military installations. Is there anything preventing the United States from increasing that presence in Greenland? Do we need Greenland for our security, or should we just start increasing, or should we ask the Danes if we can increase our presence there? Is there anything preventing us from augmenting our security presence in Greenland presently with the present sort of setup that we have with Denmark?
Yeah, so I'd say there's a couple of elements to that. Like on paper, from an authorities perspective, we have what we need to be able to have a greater presence in Greenland. When we created our original treaty with Denmark that included Greenland in 1951, it was very favorable to the United States, as quite frankly, many of our treaties have been that we created around that time frame. Immensely favorable to U.S. interests, to allowing us to have greater access, to be able to define what that might be. And so I think from a piece of paper perspective, there's not much more that we could ask for. But I will say that one of the challenges in the past has been trust. And as I alluded to before, that there has been a lack of trust of what U.S. intentions could be. And I think there's been a little bit of a quizzicalness of like how much military do we need to have on the island. The invasion of Ukraine totally changed the game, though. And is that not just for Greenland, but I think for all of the Nordic states, as Marisol already alluded to, what previously these many countries, many of the Nordic capitals, and Greenland included, I think really had a reticence towards investment in the military. I think there was a kind of a strategic question of like, why are the threats really there? The invasion of Ukraine created a totally different public atmosphere for investment and security, allowing for the United States to have really critical updated access to some of these Nordic capitals as well in the event of a contingency. But for Greenland, it changed the public perception of what the U.S. could do to help advance their own security. And so there was, I think in the last several years, actually a very open appetite to listening and trusting the United States. And when we would come to them to say, hey, we might need to do this, or let's think about that, let's think about exercise here or there, that the trust factor was very high in the past couple of years. And I think one of the challenges has been in the recent months is an increasing trust deficit that I think you can very clearly see in the open press. But one of back to your initial question of what else is preventing, I think the signaling that you're seeing from Greenland now to really be with Denmark, to be a member of NATO, also works in the interest of the United States now. We can still work with them cooperatively. We can still try to advance our own security from a homeland defense perspective and European collective security and Greenlandic security by working with Denmark and Greenland now via NATO.
And one of the things that we've been seeing, at least from Denmark, is the pressure on Denmark and the focus on Arctic security. There's been an increase in Danish commitment to the defense of Greenland, increasing the force presence there. Do you think that's significant, Iris? Is that an important contribution?
Yeah, it's game changing, I think, for the Arctic. And I wouldn't just stop at Denmark. I think it's happening across the Nordic capitals. You're seeing like really game changing investments from Norway, from Sweden, from Finland, from Canada. And even from Iceland, which doesn't necessarily have a military, you're seeing some real commitment from a monetary perspective, but also critically, I think, and this is, I think one of the silver linings of the Trump administration's tactics has been a forcing of Arctic capitals to really try to define what is in their own interest. I do think that there has been a tendency at times to look to the United States for the answers. And I think that we should be working hand in glove with these partners. Like I said before, allies are our strength, but it's also really important for our partners to define for themselves what security means for them and how they should be investing in their own security that also enhances our collective security. And so some of these investments that you're seeing in Nordic capitals, including Denmark, kind of for the first time, really making some big announcements in Greenland. I think they said $13.7 billion investing in obviously F-35s, which has implications for Arctic security, but also infrastructure and building out the Joint Arctic Command, some maritime patrol vessels, and some maritime domain awareness unmanned aircraft. All of that, I think, is useful for broader Arctic security and certainly useful for U.S. security in trying to maintain the eastern flank.
And Marisol, let me bring you in here as well. What are your thoughts on the security environment, security situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think Iris just summed that up extremely well. We have seen very significant investments. So to kind of also reduce it to saying that it's just a dog sled is such a gross understatement of the way that Denmark is really stepping up in response to the concerns that the U.S. has voiced. And I would say that really, again, taking this allied approach it makes so much sense, but also the alternative would have so many unintended harms associated with it that I think are really underappreciated. And so again, I think it's just really important to look at how much we have to gain from that cooperative approach. And then also just kind of zooming out again, it's more complicated than just Greenland, right? So even within the Kingdom of Denmark, I mentioned the Faroe Islands before, and I also mentioned earlier about how the Greenland ice sheet is over a mile high at its peak. And so there's places where basically Pituffik, the radar cuts out because of the height of the ice sheet. And that was a concern of the US, which we shared with the Danes. And so they invested in a radar array on the Faroe Islands, which would be, further to the east if you're looking at the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. So that's also where some of these investments that Denmark is making into long-range drones and radar on the east coast of Greenland can help us with reducing any gaps in our all-domain awareness, which is really the one of the major security challenges for the Arctic, is being able to detect, track, and need to defend against any type of threats that we do perceive in the region.
Yeah, if we just go back to the map for a second, just to point out the GI-UK gap as it's referred to. This is the straits between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK here. And it's really, there's always a concern about Russia's submarines coming through and targeting U.S. and transatlantic shipping lanes, particularly if we were in a conflict with Russia and we were sending forces from continental U.S. over to Europe, similar to what we saw during World War II, where Nazi U-boats were targeting shipping convoys. And so that is a very strategic set of waterways that is of increasing focus. Maybe to turn now to the critical minerals question. So this is the other sort of major rationale about U.S. potential, U.S. wanting the territory to possess it, possess Greenland as a U.S. territory. How do you see the critical minerals question? Marisol, I'll start with you. it is no doubt that Greenland is incredibly mineral rich, but as you mentioned, there's a lot of ice. It is not the easiest place to get in and out of. There's, I think, less than 100 miles of roadways. The infrastructure is not very great. So how do you assess the critical mineral question? So they're there. Seems not quite economical to actually extract. So how do you assess this, and how is that going to evolve with the impacts of climate change?
Yeah, so I mean, you hit upon some of the key pieces here. So we have a lack of infrastructure. Yes, there are many deposits. You need the infrastructure to get to the mine, to build the mine, then to get the product to port. And these are questions that don't yet have answers because of how much upfront capital would be necessary to facilitate this. And so from a business perspective, it just hasn't made sense for a lot of these deposits to be pursued. And that's why you don't see a lot of mining on Greenland. Additionally, there are ways in which the US needs to be building its own private sector expertise to conduct mining operations in such an austere and extreme environment. And I would just point to, one example of an anorthosite mine, I believe it was last year, where there was a 30-year lease that there was not even a US company that bid on it. So it went to a French-Danish consortium, no interest from the private sector in the US. There are certain deposits like the Tanbreeze deposit that has some commercial potential, certainly, but I think this is again a place where we have the Joint Committee, which is a specific forum for the US and Greenland to discuss economic development, including through mining. Greenland had previously joined the Strategic Minerals Partnership. They have indicated a very much an interest in doing more business with the US, with American companies, also with Europe. And we're seeing a lot more interest from the EU as well. This all just ties into some of the larger issues that we have with processing, right? We need to build, our ability to process some of these minerals, because China dominates not just the mineral supply chain, but also the processing as well. So I think that this is an area where there's a real opportunity for cooperation between the US and Europe and Canada to be looking at, how do we catalyze some of that investment that makes sense and maybe provide some incentives in the short term to help some of these companies be more cost competitive, especially because China does distort the market so much. So in order to get around that, there are ways we can create incentives and then have them in the long term, be more competitive on the free market. But again, this is something that through a cooperative approach, we could, discuss some ways to try to inject the needed upfront capital.
Yeah. So just to follow up, I mean, it seems to me that there's a way forward here where long-term lease agreements, a more cooperative approach, where the U.S. could have access to lots of the resources here without actually possessing Greenland. I think the president's argument is that if only the U.S., the only guarantee of all the profits coming to the U.S. is if Greenland's actually a territory of the United States and actually possess it. What do you think of that argument, Marisol?
I would say it's not borne out by facts.
And Iris, when you were in the Pentagon, I mean, there's obviously a need for critical minerals, but do you think there's a need to actually possess Greenland for the economic aspects here, or is that how much weight do you give to that argument?
Yeah, I mean, just to give a little bit more context, in addition to how Marisol has described the opportunity, the economic opportunity. Greenland has made very clear that they are open for business. This is not it's not a new topic to talk about critical minerals in Greenland. It was something that we were really looking at heavily in the last administration. They've tried to how to have partnership, how to have trade, mining trade shows with one another and talking about best practices and where U.S. companies could potentially gain access some of the minerals for both U.S. interests, but also Greenlandic interests. Some of the challenges that have existed, in addition to what Marisol said about the price point, is local politics are actually a really I think, rated challenge here. Like anywhere, folks want to protect their environment, especially where have subsistence needs based on the environment. They don't want to see their environment torn apart by foreign companies or by companies in general, and then left to clean up the mess. This is back to this trust deficit of like, what are the real intentions of activity? I think where you can see a win-win for the Greenlandic population, local Greenlanders, and for commercial interests, and for U.S. and allied interests, that's where you'll see mining potential go forward. Where the Department of Defense really needs help with critical minerals is in working with allies and partners. I mean, we've long known about some of the deficits that we have for critical minerals and rare earths, and we really need to be leaning on our allies and partners to help co-develop and continue to work on our stockpiling and look at where we need to be investing together. The Defense Production Authority actually recently gave kind of the umbrella to Canada and Australia as so we can domestically invest there using Defense Department authorities to invest in mining and processing capabilities within Canada and Australia. I think that's an interesting option for us to look at for Greenland. If Greenland is really part of the North American continent, maybe we could look at extending Defense Production Authority to there, so that economic case where you could maybe justify paying a security premium on some of these minerals could actually bear out.
We're just about at time, but I want to ask sort of one sort of final question. It's a thorny one. So, the president has clearly indicated that he wants Greenland to be flying an American flag over it and be part of the United States. Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, has indicated that's if the U.S. were to take action to achieve that outcome, it would be the end of the NATO alliance. And I'm curious for your take on where things are right now and what are the potential risks that you see it going forward. It seems like there's been some positive consequences of the administration's focus on the Arctic that has prompted sort of more European focus and spending and efforts, Denmark and others focusing on the Arctic. It's probably serving to help box out China and others from participating a little bit more. But are there risks that we sort of push this too far? And I'm curious for how you see this progressing or going forward, or what is the kind of best case scenario? What are the kind of worst case scenario outcomes that you see coming from this? Marisol, maybe we'll start with you to close.
Okay. So let's see. Best case scenario, what I'm hoping for is that we can just maybe, if we want to tweak some agreements like the 1951 defense agreement, if, kind of repackaging certain things, if they want to name it in some way that's more appealing to Trump, I don't care. It's really, when it comes down to it, the alliance is absolutely essential to U.S. security, to securing our interests. We're dealing with an era of disruption. There's a very high potential. It's not just black swans, which are, unexpected events. It's gray swans, knowing that we have very disruptive things that we are going to be contending with, whether it's through advanced tech, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing, and, catastrophic climate change, the undermining of planetary boundaries. Like, we need to be getting in front of these things. And there's ways in which, the U.S. is taking a certain approach right now that actually makes it more important that our allies are compensating in certain ways. The fact that Finland has the report for the future, the report on the future, that's actually looking at future scenarios that incorporate climate change. That's more important now, since the United States has really minimize the way that we are approaching climate risk or environmental change more broadly, specifically with not having the National Intelligence Council Strategic Futures Group. So that cooperation is going to be more important than ever. And so I'm kind of taking the longer view here with just understanding the trajectory, how important the alliance is, and just looking at how much we have to gain from this cooperation. And a worst case scenario is you cripple the thing that is your major strategic enabler, and then you have to deal with all the unintended consequences that come along with that. Which I think, as we're seeing basically every theater flaring up right now, I just don't think that's really a strategically sound move.
Marisol, over to you. Or sorry, Iris, over to you for final thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. I think I totally agree with Marisol that the NATO alliance is really critical to U.S. interests, to European interests, but for our own homeland defense interests. And this, the use of strategic ambiguity that we've seen come out of the Trump administration, I think we've seen it, strategic ambiguity, talking about use of military force. I think we've seen it in the context of Venezuela. We've seen it in the context of Taiwan. And maybe strategic ambiguity works well with adversaries. Arguably it does. I think when you start to use strategic ambiguity towards allies, it's a questionable premise. It starts to erode the trust that exists for us to operate and to secure our own interests in the region. It's really in the U.S. interest to keep the region stable and secure, and also just point blank, the U.S. cannot go it alone in the region. You might be able to do that in other parts of the world, but it's so challenging to operate from an environment. The geography doesn't allow for that to take place. So we need to be leaning aggressively and heavily into the benefits that our partners provide.
Yeah, not to editorialize too much, but it does strike me that there's a real danger that the, I think, administration underestimates the potential European response here. That if it pushes this too far, I don't think it's just Denmark, it would be the European Union, and there could be real impacts for NATO. I do think it would probably be the end of NATO, but I also think that markets are probably really underpricing the risk. The US-EU economic relationship is one of the most important in the history of the world, and there would be tremendous economic consequences, I think, for US tech companies and others if we were to take this sort of action to actually try to seize Greenland against the will of the Greenlandic people as well as Denmark. And in a trade war to the death, the U.S. probably wins that against the EU, but the EU can inflict so much economic difficulties to us as well. It's the relationship, the economic relationship compared to what we trade with China, it just pales in comparison. So I think we're in a really tenuous spot here. And the best case scenario, I think, as you all have laid out so well, is that we're focused now a lot more in the Arctic. There's a lot more happening with Europeans, particularly with Denmark. There's a lot more focus on the Greenlandic people, on their issues, their concerns, their needs, and also the effects of climate change on the Arctic. So this has been, I think, in some ways, real positive, the focus, but there's a danger that we push it too far, and we'll see what happens in the White House meeting that is taking place right now. But Iris, Marisol, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I also want to thank those that were tuning in. This has been a special live event of our Eurofile podcast. You can sign up and subscribe to the Eurofile wherever you get your podcasts. Please do that. Also, always good to give us 5 stars. You can also check out our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, where we talk about all things Russia. Again, I'm Max Bergman. It's been a real pleasure to have you. Thanks so much for joining us here at CSIS.